The wind rolled down the San Pedro Valley like an old knife, rusted by centuries of silence. It didn't bring snow, just that kind of frost that clings to dry roots and cracks like bone under your boots. No one with sense would be walking out there that day. No one, except her. He saw her collapse. A young, dark-skinned figure, thin and trembling, dropped to her knees beside the river like the world had squeezed the last bit of breath out of her. Trace Calder froze. His rifle hung at his side, but it wasn't the weight of the gun that held him still. It was memory. He'd seen this before. A different woman. A different loss. A different winter. And back then, he did nothing. This time, damn it, he wasn't going to stand by. He crossed the frozen ground without a word, scooped her up in his arms. She was ice cold, but still breathing. A second figure stepped from the brush. Another woman, older, eyes lit with suspicion, her back straight like a spear. She didn't say a thing, just followed close behind like a wolf ready to bite if it came to it. Trace didn't ask for permission, didn't need it. Out here, you either did the right thing or dug graves. The ranch stood like a whisper in the middle of nowhere. An old wooden cabin, no frills, no lies. Inside, he lit the fire, boiled water, laid out blankets. No words, just action. In a place like this, words could get you killed. The young woman, he figured later her name was Rhea, barely moved, but when her eyes flickered open for a heartbeat, they didn't plead. They judged. Even half delirious, she was still sizing up the man who pulled her from the ice. The other one, likely her sister, was Tiva. Strong. Silent. Her hands cracked from cold, her face carved with the hardness of someone who learned to protect before she ever learned to trust. She stood between him and Rhea like a sentry at the gate. Trace understood that kind of language, didn't need words. In the West, trust isn't requested. It's earned, and if you lose it, you never get it back. Rhea started burning up, her neck slick with sweat, but her skin still cold as the floorboards. Trace knew what that meant. He'd seen folks die like that. Slow. Quiet. He wasn't about to let it happen again. He added wood to the fire, soaked cloths, wet her lips. Every move deliberate, every pause measured. And all the while, he felt the weight of the years he'd spent running from this exact thing, caring about someone again. Tiva watched him like a drawn knife. When he got too close, her voice cut through the silence. "You can stop now." It wasn't a suggestion. Trace lifted his hands, palms open. "I'm not done." The air didn't soften. Silence pressed down like powder before a spark. But she didn't reply. Just shifted. Just enough. After midnight, when the wind slapped the cabin like a wild animal, Rhea whispered something in her native tongue. Tiva answered in the voice of someone who's been too close to death too many times. Rhea opened her eyes, looked straight at Trace, and asked, her voice barely holding together, "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the flames. Thought about the last time he hesitated. All he lost by not stepping forward. Then he said it. "Because you were still breathing." That was all. Nothing more. Rhea closed her eyes, and for the first time, slept. Trace stepped back without a word, but that question, why, stayed with him, like a chill deep in the bone. The night offered no kindness. The wind rattled the roof until the beams groaned like they wanted to give out. Inside, the fire held on, pushing its warmth slow and stubborn. Trace Calder didn't sleep a wink. He paced, stirred the coals, checked Rhea's breath, wrestled with a memory that refused to loosen its grip. Sleep would have been easier. but dreams were traitorous. In there, behind the eyes, things replayed, and he'd lived enough already. Rhea was still breathing, and for now, that was enough. Tiva never moved. She stayed at the side of the cot, one hand resting gently on her sister's shoulder, her eyes locked on Trace, watching for the slightest misstep. She didn't speak, didn't drift off, just stayed, solid and silent, like an old oak that's seen more winters than it cares to count. At dawn, Trace stepped outside. The cold bit at his face, and he welcomed it. It brought clarity. He walked the corral, checked the fences, looked over the cattle. Routine was his anchor, one action after another, something his hands could do so his mind wouldn't wander. The river was still there, flowing like it didn't give a damn about what happened on the land beside it. Maybe it didn't. In the West, nothing owed you anything, not even the landscape. When he came back, the door was slightly ajar. Someone had added wood to the fire. In the kitchen, an old pot let off steam. Tiva moved in silence, like she'd been living there for years. She gave him a dry look. No judgment, no gratitude. Just recognition. Rhea was still lying down, though a little more upright. Her eyes followed every movement with that quiet kind of watchfulness that makes you uncomfortable. Trace set a mug of hot broth on the table and stepped back. She didn't touch it, looked to her sister. Tiva picked it up, brought it to her lips, and said, "Drink." It wasn't a command. It was a certainty. Rhea drank, slowly. Each sip seemed like a deliberate effort, like she had to teach her body how to accept help. Trace kept his distance. He knew the body needed warmth, but the soul needed space. No good came from pushing. The rest of the day passed like a wordless dance. He fixed a loose hinge, sharpened a blade, split wood. Simple, steady sounds, like a heartbeat. Tiva sorted what little food they had, folded blankets, rationed water like someone who'd lived too long without. By late afternoon, with light slanting low through the window, Rhea spoke. "You live far." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Trace looked up from the knife he was honing. "Far enough." She nodded, like that answered more than he said. "It's quiet here." He shrugged. Quiet was the idea. The silence returned, but not like before. It wasn't tight. It was the kind of silence that settles between people who've stopped watching each other and started listening. That evening, Trace took Tiva to the small cabinet where he kept dried herbs, showed her what each one was for. He'd learned from his wife many years back, though that part wasn't mentioned. "This one helps when the cold gets into the bones," he said. "And this?" Tiva asked, showing interest for the first time. "For when the coughing squeezes your lungs." She didn't thank him, just nodded, storing the knowledge like firewood for winters yet to come. When they were done, she turned to him and said, "We won't stay long." It wasn't a threat. It was a line. Trace held her gaze. "I didn't expect you to." Rhea said nothing. But under the blanket, her fingers tightened around the fabric a little harder than needed. Trace saw it, and instead of going toward her, he turned away. He wasn't about to go looking for meaning where it hadn't been earned yet. That night, he sat by the fire again, wordless. But this time, the silence didn't ache. The third day broke slow. The sky was gray but didn't threaten a storm. Just that damp stillness winter leaves when it starts to loosen its grip. The mud by the ranch door didn't crack under his boots anymore. It just sank. Trace Calder noticed it as he stepped outside. He also noticed something else. For the first time since their arrival, Tiva's tracks weren't fresh in the snow. She hadn't gone out to patrol the perimeter. Something had shifted. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned. The pot simmered softly, giving off a smell that wasn't pleasant, but necessary. A mix of thyme, old onion, and rancid fat hung in the air like a warning. This place was for surviving, not celebrating. Rhea was sitting up, not fully straight, but enough to show that her body, though still aching, was no longer dead weight. The blanket covered her legs, her hands rested firm on top. Her eyes were on Trace, as always, but this time, not with suspicion. There was something else now. Something that didn't demand answers, but did ask for presence. Tiva held a cup between her hands. She said nothing. But she did everything. "You don't have to," Trace said, his voice calm. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to Rhea since she asked. "Why?" She didn't answer right away. Took another sip, breathed slowly, then lifted her gaze. "I know," she said, and drank again. That reply hung in the air like smoke from the hearth, light, warm, and uncomfortable. Trace stepped away, grabbed the axe, and went outside to split wood. He needed to cut something. Not for the cold, for what was inside. For hours, he worked without rest. The wood cracked, flew, fell. Every strike was a word he didn't dare speak. Every splinter, a thought he wasn't ready to face. By the time the sun dipped west and shadows stretched out like tired fingers, he came back in. Brushed the snow from his shoulders, left his boots by the door, and washed his hands in cold water. Tiva was folding blankets. Rhea was sewing. She had found his shirt, the one with a tear in the sleeve, and was mending it with thick thread and clumsy but determined hands. Trace stopped in his tracks. "You didn't have to," he said. She didn't look up. "I'm doing it anyway." There was no defiance in her voice, just resolve. One of those things said without asking for permission or forgiveness, said the way someone might declare the sky is gray or that water is wet. Trace didn't respond. He wasn't sure he could. That night, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. But when she handed the shirt back, folded and clean, he didn't know whether to thank her or leave it on the table like nothing had happened. He left it on the table. But that night, he didn't sleep the same. The days passed quietly, like frost disappearing under the sun without asking leave. No bells, no gunfire, no grand words, just small gestures, wood chopped, water heated, clothes stitched, wounds no longer weeping. And in the middle of it all, the habit of not saying more than needed. Rhea was walking now. Slowly, yes. Carefully. But walking. Sometimes she'd trace a small path around the cabin, as if testing the world again for the first time. Trace watched from a distance, didn't step in, didn't offer help. He'd learned that sometimes helping can hurt. She didn't ask for anything either. No words, no favors, just space. In the mornings, she handled small chores, sorting dried beans, folding blankets, wiping down a table. In the afternoons, she'd sit by the fire, sharpening needles, stitching loose seams, checking the condition of the saddlebags. Tiva watched her with a mix of relief and quiet sorrow. She knew she couldn't hold her back like before. Her sister's body was no longer a battlefield, but soil freshly tilled, starting to grow again. And that, deep down, hurt too. One afternoon, with warm orange light pouring through the window, Trace left the door ajar and went out to fix the fence by the corral. The cold had swelled the wood, loosening a board. He was crouched down, hammer in hand, when he heard footsteps. Rhea. She didn't say anything, just knelt beside him and picked up a few nails, held them out without meeting his eyes. "Don't you have another shirt to patch?" he joked, not trying to sound hard. She tilted her head. "I know how to use my hands for other things, too." He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. They didn't argue. They finished the fence in silence. He hammered. She held. The wind passed by, cold but not cruel, and somewhere in that stillness, something settled. That night Rhea sat by the fire again with needle and thread. She wasn't mending anything. Just passed the thread through, again and again, like someone searching for meaning in the drag of wool against steel. Trace watched her from the table. Wanted to say something. Didn't know how. It was her who spoke. "You didn't really answer." He looked up. "Answer what?" "Why you helped us." Trace took a deep breath. His fingers closed tight around the glass he was holding. "Once I stayed," he said. "I thought it was the right thing. I was wrong. And by the time I realized it, it was too late." He didn't add more. He didn't need to. Rhea didn't respond with comfort. She didn't offer relief. She just said, "Staying isn't always a mistake. Leaving doesn't always save you." He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt seen, not judged, not measured, just recognized. That night, he slept deeper than he had in a long time. And when he woke, he knew something had shifted, not in her, not in the cabin, in him. The routine began to change, not all at once, not like a storm, but like those slow cracks in stone that open when the sun finally thaws a long freeze. Rhea wasn't just surviving anymore. She moved with intention. Lit the fire before Trace was even up. Brought in wood before he reached the door. She'd even started cooking. Clumsily, but with pride, like someone wanting her presence to mean more than just a blanket taking up space. She talked more, too. Not much. Just enough for the silence to stop feeling like armor and start feeling like warmth. Sometimes she asked about the cattle, about the rain, about how to plant in dry soil. Practical questions. And Trace answered. At first, out of courtesy. Then, because he wanted to. Tiva watched, always half a step away. She hadn't let her guard down completely, but her gaze had lost its edge. What troubled her wasn't that her sister might die, but that she might stay. Trace could feel it, saw it in how Tiva no longer stood between them, but also never left them alone for long. Like she sensed something was forming, and didn't know if it was a comfort or a threat. Truth was, he didn't know either. There was something in Rhea that rattled him. It wasn't sweetness. It wasn't weakness. It was that rare mix of quiet strength and fierce tenderness he'd only seen once before, and it hadn't ended well. So he began to pull away. He left before dawn, returned after dusk, found refuge in the fields, in the fences, down by the riverbank where nothing spoke and the water didn't judge. He spoke less, looked less, ate standing up like he used to when the house was empty. Rhea noticed, but she didn't confront him, didn't reach out. She just kept going, with her chores, with her silences, as if she knew that if it was real, it had come back on its own. And that's when another kind of danger came. It started with glances. One at the butcher's, when Trace came into town for salt. Another on the road, when a stranger greeted him half-heartedly, then rode on. Then came the whispers. They say he's got 2 Apache women at his place. One stayed, the other watches. That kind of thing brings trouble. Out west, men didn't need proof to pass judgment, just rumors that outlasted the echo. One evening, as Trace was sharpening his knife on the porch, he heard the sound of hooves. Not one rider. Several. 4 men. Dust at their heels. And out front, a man who didn't ride in a rush, but with confidence, like someone come to claim what he thought was his. Trace didn't move. He stood up slow, knife still in hand, no expression on his face. Rhea stepped outside behind him, not knowing why, just sensing something in the air had snapped. Tiva appeared a moment later, stepping in front of her sister, just like she had that first time. The man dismounted. His hat was too clean for this stretch of country, his boots well polished, his words measured. "They say you're not alone, Calder." Trace said nothing. "They say you've brought trouble." Tiva lifted her chin. Didn't speak, but she was already bracing to stand in the way. And then, without warning, without permission, Rhea spoke. "If there's trouble, it's not us. It's your habit of judging what you don't understand." The silence was thick. Not even the wind dared slip through. Trace looked the man in the eye. He said just one sentence. "No one leaves here unless they choose to." And the outsider smiled. A smile without teeth. A smile that promised he'd be back. "Then you're bringing trouble on yourself." Trace didn't flinch. "I already knew that." The next morning arrived colorless. The sky wasn't blue, and the earth wasn't golden. Everything wore that grayish hue that shows up right before something breaks, even if you don't know what it is yet. Trace Calder was up before the rooster. He rose without thinking, same as always. But that day, his hands shook just a little as he fastened his belt. Not from fear, from certainty. Rhea wasn't sleeping. He found her sitting wrapped in a blanket, eyes fixed on the old wooden floor. She didn't look at him when he came in. Didn't say, "Good morning," just asked, "Will they come back?" He took a second to answer. Not because he didn't know, but because it hurt to say it. "Yes." Tiva was already outside. She patrolled the edge of the field like walking alone could keep intruders at bay. She had never been naive. But since the riders came, her whole body seemed made of stone. Not pride. Duty. 2 days passed with nothing. And that was the worst part. Waiting had a sharp edge. The horses fed. The wind blew. The cabin creaked. And no one spoke the thing they were all thinking. On the 3rd day, it happened. Dust on the far end of the trail left no doubt. 4 men, maybe 5. Not in a hurry. Not looking for a fight. Not yet. Trace didn't reach for his rifle. He reached for his hat. He stepped outside, stood in front of the door, and waited for them to come near. "Thought you understood," said the same clean-booted man, dismounting like he was walking into a saloon. Trace didn't answer. Just watched. "We've kept a certain peace in this valley for generations. You're bringing in trouble that isn't yours." This time, Trace answered. "It is now." Behind him, the door opened. Tiva came out first, body firm, eyes sharp. Then Rhea, no fear, no arrogance, just presence. The leader of the riders, now they knew his name was Creed Voss, stopped smiling. "If they leave, nothing happened here." Tiva stepped forward. Her voice was steady, not defiant, just clear. "We'll leave if we decide to. Not because someone demands it." Trace felt the decision settle in his chest like a stone that, once placed, can't be pulled out without bringing the whole wall down. "They're staying," he said. Creed stared at him. long, unblinking. You're choosing sides. Trace shook his head. I'm choosing responsibility. No one fired. No one shouted. Creed mounted up again, turned his horse, and rode off with his men. But they all knew. It wasn't a retreat. It was preparation. That night, the tension was in the air like smoke. Tiva didn't sleep. Rhea didn't either. But there was no fear. There was resolve. Trace gathered tools, adjusted hinges, reinforced doors, not out of paranoia, out of dignity. That's when she spoke. If we leave, Rhea said, plain and steady, it won't be because of them. He looked at her. There was truth in that sentence, but also a question left unspoken. And then he understood. Staying meant more than protecting. It meant committing. The wind shifted direction that morning. It wasn't exactly a sign, but close. Out in the field, the air no longer came from the north, but from the east, dry and full of fine dust, the kind that gets between your teeth even if you don't open your mouth. Trace Calder noticed it as he stepped out of the barn, and something inside him tensed, like the land itself was holding its breath. Tiva returned before noon, her steps quick, her face hard. Voss is out with 2 more men, she said bluntly. They're headed south, looking for something that doesn't exist. There was no need for questions. Trace knew exactly what that meant. Creed Voss wasn't going to surrender with words. He needed to justify his anger. He was out hunting ghosts. The rest of the day passed with everything in place, but the stillness had an edge to it. Rhea checked the supplies. Tiva cleaned knives. Trace said nothing. It was late in the afternoon when the rider arrived. He came alone. His horse was soaked in sweat, and the boy, no older than 20, had a dust-covered face and a heart worn on his sleeve. "He's fallen," he shouted without dismounting. "By the big rock. The horse slipped. He's stuck. He can't move." Silence. Tiva was the first to speak. "It's not our concern." The boy lowered his head. He didn't argue. He just waited, like someone who knows the decision's already been made but holds on to a thread of hope. Trace didn't move. Not a muscle. Rhea looked at him. Didn't speak. Just looked. But in that glance was everything. Then he stood, walked over to the hook, grabbed his coat and hat, said nothing about where he was going. "You don't owe him anything," Rhea whispered. Trace paused, nodded. "I know." "Then why?" He didn't have to think. "Because I don't want to keep living leaving things half done." And he left. Night caught up with him halfway down the trail. The wind blew hard through low pines, and the sky had shut like a door without a lock. When he reached the rock pass, he found the man there. Creed Voss, wedged between saddle and stone, his ankle twisted, his pride shattered. He didn't speak. Just stared. Just enough to show he still hadn't accepted the fall. Trace dismounted without hurry, approached without judgment, lifted, cut, wrapped. He did it all in silence, like fixing a fence that isn't yours, but is still broken. "You could have left me there," Voss said, voice cracked. Trace didn't answer. He returned to the ranch near dawn. No light shone from the cabin, but he knew they were awake. They always were when the night smelled like a decision. Rhea opened the door. Didn't ask anything. Didn't need explanations. She just looked at him and understood. He hung up his coat, sat by the fire now gone cold, and closed his eyes for a moment. What he had done didn't change the past, didn't absolve him, but it pushed him, just a little, away from the man who once chose not to act. And that, in this land, was more than most dared to do. The air had shifted since the last time Voss crossed the edge of the ranch. The threat had withdrawn, but not in defeat, in silence. And in these parts, silence could mean many things. Peace, maybe, or just a truce no one signed. Mornings brought frost again. The fire was lit before dawn, and hands moved with a little more calm. But nothing was as it had been. Trace Calder felt it in his steps. He no longer woke as if fleeing something. He got up because things waited for him that made sense. The water, the wood, the wire that needed fixing. And most of all, Rhea's eyes. They no longer looked at him with caution. They looked at him with presence. That morning, she was sitting at the table, sorting beans with a slowness that wasn't laziness. It was precision. She measured. She calculated. She decided. Like someone who had no plans to leave, Tiva stood by the wall, tightening the straps of her pack. No one asked anything. No one needed to. The decision had already been made. "You going alone?" Trace asked without looking up, still splitting wood beside the hearth. "The same way I came," she replied. Rhea stood, wordless, and walked over to her sister. There were no tears. No promises. Just two women who had crossed through too much mud together to waste words now. "You don't have to go just yet," Rhea murmured. "Yes, because you don't need me standing between you and the world anymore." Trace turned. Those words hit harder than he'd expected. He'd always seen Tiva as a steady presence, necessary, like a shield between him and the things he wasn't ready to feel. And now he understood. Her leaving meant that shield wasn't needed anymore. They ate without toasts, without speeches. Everyone knew what they needed to know. Tiva was the first to set down her empty bowl. She checked her bag one last time, headed for the door. But before crossing it, she turned to Trace. "You chose well," she said. It wasn't praise. It was fact. Then she stepped through the threshold and didn't look back. Rhea walked with her to the edge of the field. She didn't call out, didn't try to stop her. She simply breathed in the cold air, let the silence settle, and walked back with her head a little higher. Trace was waiting at the door. "I'll stay," Rhea said, "but not as someone hiding." He nodded slowly. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The rest of the day was work. Not the kind of work meant for surviving, but for building. Trace showed her where he planned to extend the fence come spring. She asked about the sun's path, about the slope of the land. He answered, holding nothing back. These weren't secrets anymore. They were plans. That evening, sitting by the fire with nothing but the creak of dry wood between them, Trace spoke. "I don't know what this is going to become. I just know I don't want to pull away from it." Rhea didn't smile, didn't reach for his hand. She simply said, "That's enough." And in that plain, honest gesture, no ornament, no fanfare, something was sealed. The ranch didn't change shape. The walls were still rough timber. The roof still creaked in the wind. The animals moved through their routines just the same. But inside, something had shifted. There were no bells, no celebrations. No one raised a glass. No one said the word new. But ever since Tiva left, every corner of the house had started to breathe differently. Rhea was no longer just passing through. She didn't occupy space. She lived in it. Each morning she rose before the sun and lit the fire without making a sound. Trace would find her in the kitchen, organizing their few supplies with a logic she hadn't learned there, but one that now belonged to the place. He took care of the outside, checking fences, counting cattle, prepping the field for what was coming. But now, when he returned, he wasn't just entering a shelter. He was stepping into a home that no longer belonged only to him. They didn't speak more than necessary. But what they said with their eyes, with how they passed each other tools, how they covered a pot, how they lit the lamp when dusk fell, carried more weight than any speech. One afternoon, while Trace was fixing a hinge that had been protesting for months, Rhea walked over with a pot of warm water. She knelt beside him without asking, without interrupting. "You've always done it like this?" she asked. Trace nodded. "Since I realized no one else would." She gave the smallest smile, like she already knew the answer. "Well, now there is someone else." She didn't say it sweetly or romantically. She said it like someone pointing out a truth and naming it so it wouldn't be forgotten. That night, Trace pulled out the chair that had been tucked against the wall for years. He placed it in front of the fire. Rhea didn't ask. She just sat down. They ate in silence. 2 bowls, 2 spoons, 2 lives that hadn't crossed by accident. Later, Trace was in the barn checking the tools when he heard footsteps. It was her. "Want me to go back inside?" she asked, without him turning around. "No, I want to help." And without waiting for permission, she rolled up her sleeves and started cleaning the horse's trough. She did it with purpose, without any show of sacrifice, just like someone who knows that sharing isn't about watching, it's about doing. From that night on, things began to fall into place differently. Tools found new spots. Supplies were counted in 2s. Firewood was stacked twice as high. But there was no sense of taking over, only cooperation. One morning, as Trace was trimming dry branches near the river, he thought back to the first time he saw her there, lying in the snow, about to vanish. The memory didn't bring guilt. It brought clarity. Saving her hadn't erased the past. But choosing her, day by day, that was building something bigger than regret. When he returned to the house, he found her stitching a strip of leather with fresh thread. She wasn't doing it out of necessity. She was doing it because she wanted things to last. "This place feels different," she said without looking up. Trace sat down across from her. He watched her for a moment. "It is." No more words followed. Because in the West, the important things aren't spoken. They're shown. Life didn't change all at once. There was no sign in the sky, no special sunrise. But from within the ranch, something felt different. As if the land had finally decided to offer more than dust and resistance. The wind no longer hit with anger. It just blew. The mornings were still cold, sure, but they didn't sting the same. Trace Calder woke each day with the same steps as always, but his silences were no longer shields. They were the natural pauses between one task and the next. Rhea moved with that same quiet rhythm of someone who has learned that home isn't measured by walls, but by choice. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't plan it. But they were living it. Rhea had grown used to seeing the land as if it were hers. She knew where meltwater collected, where the horses looked for shade at noon, and which corners needed fixing before the spring mud rolled in. Trace let her decide. And she returned each gesture in kind. Not with words, but with action. The ranch had begun to feel like something else. Not cleaner, not prettier, but more shared. The nails were kept where both could reach them. The supplies were stored with logic, not urgency. And the once empty chair was no longer a symbol of loss. It was a thing in use. One afternoon, Trace went out to look at the river. He did that sometimes, without any real reason. He'd just watch the water go by, like he was trying to remind himself that the things that matter aren't always held on to. Sometimes, You just walk beside them. There, standing still, he remembered the first day he saw her. Rhea, lying in the snow, barely breathing, and him, torn between stepping forward or walking away. That memory no longer weighed as guilt. It was clarity. He hadn't saved her out of heroism, and she hadn't stayed out of gratitude. What they had didn't grow from what was missing, but from what both chose to tend. When he returned to the house, he found her sitting by the hearth, stitching a leather cinch. When she looked up, she didn't ask where he'd been. She just said, "This place doesn't feel the same anymore." Trace looked at her, sat beside her. "No, and I don't want it to." She set the cinch aside. "Do you know what this is? The ranch?" "No, what you and I are building." He thought about it for a moment, then replied, plain and steady, "I don't know, but I'm not walking away from it." Rhea nodded, like someone who didn't need more. "That's enough." There was no hug, no kiss, just two people sitting by the fire, understanding that life doesn't ask for promises, only presence. The days that followed weren't extraordinary, but none of them were accidental. Tiva didn't return, but a week later, a passing hunter said he'd seen her with a small group of Apaches heading east, where the water held longer and the hills gave shelter from the wind. Trace heard the news and nodded. He didn't say anything more. Rhea didn't either. But something in their gestures seemed lighter. The ranch kept changing in small ways. The bench by the door got fixed. The pantry was reorganized. Furrows were drawn into the dry earth. One night, as he sharpened an old knife and she sorted empty sacks, Trace looked up. "I didn't know this was possible," he said. Rhea smiled without turning. It wasn't until it was. Winter slowly fell behind them. The frost withdrew like a tired enemy, worn out from trying. The sun began to warm things earlier. The river ran clear. Not like before, but like now. And the ranch, that patch of land that never promised anything, started to feel like a place where staying wasn't a burden anymore, but a choice. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to join us in discovering more real stories of the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who carved paths through the wild. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments. Come ride with us again across this untamed land. Thank you.